Shlaska and Corda, and I very much welcome the opportunity to mark the second anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. I'd like to take an opportunity to welcome Larissa Garasko, Ambassador of Ukraine. Thank you for your presence and indeed for your significant contribution to keeping this issue on the agenda of, I'm sure, a lot of my colleagues and indeed government, because I think it is critically important that we continue to support the people of Ukraine as best we can. There's no doubt, Shlaska and Corda, that Vladimir Putin and his administration poses a direct threat, not just to Ireland, but to the entire European continent and indeed the globe. And that is abundantly clear from his actions and that of his military over the last two years. If his military machine is allowed to win, then what is next? Who is next? And those are stark warnings to our European colleagues and indeed global countries across the globe who contribute to Ukraine's defence effort. We may be a neutral nation, but as has been said by both Taoiseach and Tánaiste and many others, we're not neutral when it comes to our abhorrence of war, of warmongering and of murder of civilians, whether that be in Ukraine or indeed in Israel or the occupied territories. And the events of the last 2 years, and I'm glad that Deputy Gannon mentioned places like Mariupol, which horrified the world. You know, we think back to the events of both the Second World War and in Ukraine's contexts, a number of events that occurred just before the Second World War, where millions of their countrymen and women were effectively murdered by a different regime, but a Russian one nonetheless. And I know that colleagues across both European parliaments that I visited and indeed the European Parliament itself are acutely aware that giving in to Russian aggression will amount to support of Russian aggression, and that in of itself cannot be allowed to stand. I think that the position of the European Union and indeed in attempts to influence our partners across the world, up to and including other countries who might not necessarily be those that would step forward quite quickly, such as India, for instance, introducing sanctions and indeed brings greater pressure on the Russian government. But some of the stark figures that we must consider over the past 2 years has in fact been that, according to US defense officials, an estimated 315,000 Russian soldiers have either been injured or killed. And that killed or injured numbers over both sides immense, from a military perspective, immense to over 500,000. It is exceedingly difficult, of course, to get the number of individuals, citizens of Ukraine and others who have been murdered by Russian soldiers, but one would have to assume that it is in the tens of thousands. And it is for those individuals and indeed for those remaining in Ukraine that we must redouble our efforts to put the necessary pressures on the Russian Federation to stop this pointless failure of a military campaign, given we are led to believe that somewhere between 15 and 20% of Ukraine is occupied after 2 years, with no sign, frankly, of the territory increasing. And on that basis, for what was labelled a quick offensive has started to look decidedly like a conflict which will end up, like so many others in former Soviet republics, which is a frozen conflict, wars between neighbours in relation to artificial boundaries. But there are no artificial boundaries when it comes to the sovereign territory of Ukraine, and therefore Ukraine must stop this pointless, frankly, act of self-sabotage and withdraw their forces and restore the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We have, unfortunately, seen a significant rise in the number of casualties in Ukraine, civilian casualties, with the UN reporting in January that there had been a 37% increase as compared to November of 2023. And that is, of course, due to widespread missile and drone attacks on urban areas and urban communities, which in of itself is unacceptable. I think it's very obvious that Putin and his proponents are assuming that fatigue will set in amongst the Western nations, and that to sow division on the issue and weaken the Western resolve. Well, while there might be some issues in the United States in particular, I note that the European continent has provided double the financial and military support to Ukraine over that of our American counterparts. And that shouldn't be forgotten, because defence of Europe defence for Ukraine is defence of Europe, and that in of itself is important. I'm not a warmonger. I'm not somebody who advocates war. I'm not somebody who advocates a change to our policies at all. Quite the opposite. I consider myself to be a pacifist, but you know, one must defend oneself, and I don't think that there will be any question that if we were invaded on foot, the Irish people would respond on foot, and if you were invaded and you have an army, you will respond with an army, and that is important from the perspective of Ukraine. Ceann Comhairle, some very interesting figures were released today by the Central Statistics Office, which show that just under 105,000 Ukrainians have sought shelter on our shores under the Temporary Protection Directive since March of 2023, and I've welcomed quite a few of them personally. 46% of those who have arrived are women over 20, while 31% are children, and some 41,000 of those who have made Ireland their home have engaged with employment support arranged by Intrio, while a further 17,000 have engaged in further education and training. And I think those are frankly fantastic statistics, and that show that the people who have had to come to these shores are genuinely trying to better themselves through education, but also to take up employment. And they're not here for fun, that's for obvious. And therefore, you know, they should be commended for trying to make Ireland their home, even if it is on a temporary basis. Until you know, peace is restored in Ukraine. I think that it is important that we redouble our efforts to work with our allies to ensure the stability, that stability is restored, and that we as a state do all that we can to provide support, non-lethal support, to Ukraine and her people. And I certainly stand foursquare with them in that policy. It is not an easy task, and nor is it a prospect of a continuation of this conflict. I have no doubt is extremely troubling to every citizen of Ukraine, but Ireland will continue to play its part in supporting them, and I certainly will endeavour to do so. Ceann Comhairle, thank you.